Imagine waking up as the president of a nation, confident that your security is airtight, only to discover your closest advisor is secretly working with foreign operatives, and every move you've made, every conversation you've had, every plan you've whispered has been fed to a hidden enemy for years. This isn't the plot of a Hollywood thriller. This is the real story of Ibrahim Traoré, the leader who uncovered Israel's covert operations inside Burkina Faso. What he did next would shake the world, shatter alliances, and ignite a fire of resistance across Africa. Stay with me. This story only gets more explosive. Let's step into the shoes of Ibrahim Traoré, a man who rose from the ranks of the military to become the most consequential leader in Burkina Faso's modern history. Traoré believed in one thing above all else: his people's right to sovereignty, free from the shadows of foreign interference. But even the sharpest leader can be blindsided. One ordinary morning, what began as a routine security briefing spiraled into a nightmarish discovery. Hidden beneath layers of encrypted reports, Traoré found evidence of a secret Israeli surveillance operation, one that had wormed its way not just into his government, but his own inner circle. This film isn't just about espionage or geopolitics. It's about betrayal, courage, and the moment when one man's refusal to stay silent changed the fate of a continent. Here's how we'll uncover this incredible story. First, the shocking discovery that rocked Traoré's world. Then the deep betrayal that put his life on the line. We'll follow his daring counterstrike, witness the shockwaves through Africa and the world, and finally see the ultimate price of leadership, when the truth comes at a devastating cost. Ready? Let's begin. It began like any other day. President Ibrahim Traoré sat behind his polished desk, the scent of strong coffee in the air, sifting through a stack of routine military reports. The morning sun poured in, glinting off the badges on his uniform. He had learned to trust his instincts from years on the front lines, but nothing could have prepared him for what was about to cross his desk. As he reached for a fresh report, Defense Minister Kabour, his old friend from the academy, burst through the doors, eyes wild, breathless, clutching a file marked with the government's highest security clearance. Kabour's hands shook. He handed Traoré the folder, unable to disguise his fear. "Mr. President," he managed, his voice thin and strained, "we intercepted something last night, something you need to see." Traoré, used to crisis, felt a chill run down his spine as he flipped open the file. Inside were radio transcripts, dense technical sheets, and maps, each piece more alarming than the last. It wasn't the standard threat. The data showed a web of encrypted communications. The source? Tel Aviv. The destinations? Hidden assets, scattered throughout Burkina Faso. The words on the page didn't make sense at first. Israel? Here? His coffee grew cold and forgotten as the magnitude of the discovery took hold. For years, while Traoré had built his government on the bedrock of national sovereignty, foreign operatives had been living undetected in the heart of his country, spying, sabotaging, gathering intelligence with a precision that bordered on obsession. Every page told a story of betrayal, not just betrayal by distant powers, but betrayal by proximity, by people who walked his halls, who dined with his family. Kabour's voice broke through the storm. "We estimate these transmissions have been active for at least 3 years, possibly longer." Traoré's heart pounded. 3 years? All that time, critical state secrets, economic data, and personal conversations. His conversations had been quietly siphoned away. Worse still, the operation had gone undetected, despite all the checks and balances he'd put in place. He wondered, who else knew? Who could he trust? The reality was suffocating. The enemy wasn't outside the gates, but already inside. As the evidence piled up, fear gave way to resolve. Traoré wasn't just fighting for his own reputation or political future, he was fighting for the soul of his nation. But every instinct screamed at him to move carefully. The network he'd uncovered wasn't sloppy. It was methodical, thorough, and had access at the highest levels. If he acted too quickly, he'd risk alerting the operatives before he truly understood how deep the roots ran. And yet, with each passing minute, the cost of inaction grew. The president sat back in his chair, eyes fixed on the flickering monitor displaying intercepted messages in cold, bureaucratic language that hid devastation in its simplicity. The world he thought he controlled was suddenly unrecognizable. But Traoré would not let fear dictate his response. The story of his fight back, of the betrayals yet to come, was only beginning. And as the sun set over Ouagadougou, he prepared for the long, dangerous night ahead. The days that followed were a blur of late-night meetings and hushed conversations behind locked doors. Traoré's world had shrunk to a circle of absolute secrecy, just him, Kabour, and 2 trusted intelligence officers. The corridors of the presidential palace, once a place of camaraderie and pride, now echoed with suspicion. Every familiar face became a potential mask for the enemy. As they dug deeper, one truth emerged: the Israeli operation had been terrifyingly intimate. Surveillance equipment wasn't just in government offices or military outposts, it had been installed in places meant to be sanctuaries. Traoré's own private quarters were swept, again and again, but each time he wondered, is it enough? The weight of invisible eyes pressed down, suffocating. The investigation soon took a personal, devastating turn. A file surfaced, buried deep in the intelligence archives, a psychological profile labeled, Subject, Ibrahim Traoré Threat Assessment, Critical. It had been created by foreign analysts months before he'd even taken office. Traoré scanned the pages in disbelief, clinical notes on his upbringing, his suspected sympathies for Russia, his speeches on African self-determination. It was all there. The chilling final section. Neutralization options. The realization landed like a punch. They'd been preparing for his removal, his assassination, long before he knew the rules of this new, dangerous game. But the cruelest blow came from within his own household. Kabur, reluctant and grim, slid another folder across the table. Inside was a photograph that made Traoré's blood freeze. Colonel David Ouedraogo, his longtime personal security advisor, the man who knew his children's birthdays, who had broken bread at his family table, was pictured shaking hands with an Israeli Mossad officer in a discreet, downtown cafe. The air left the room. Traoré's mind raced through memories, the times Ouedraogo had insisted on accompanying him to sensitive meetings, his casual questions about schedules, his sudden disappearances during crucial decisions, betrayal. Not from distant strangers, but from those closest to him. It was a wound deeper than any political scandal, a fracture at the center of his trust. The president forced himself to maintain composure, even as his heart pounded in his chest. Who else was compromised? How many more secrets had slipped through unseen cracks? Could he even trust himself to know the difference between loyalty and deception? The next 48 hours were relentless. Intelligence teams worked around the clock, uncovering surveillance hardware in 3 separate locations, tracing internet traffic through hidden Israeli servers, even finding evidence of a targeted assassination list, names of local leaders who had spoken against Israel's policies, now dead, their murders blamed on others. The scope was overwhelming, but Traoré knew what had to be done. For the first time in his presidency, fear became his constant companion. But he refused to be paralyzed. This was his country, his people, his responsibility. Betrayed but not broken, Traoré steeled himself for the confrontation ahead. He would not let treachery define Burkina Faso's future. The time for secrets was over. The battle for Africa's soul was just beginning. Traoré knew there was no turning back. Every step he took was now a step into enemy territory, except the enemy wasn't across the border, but operating from deep within his own government. The air in the palace was electric, charged with a mixture of dread and anticipation. Sleepless, Traoré reviewed each intercepted message, each technical diagram, each chilling file on assassination plots. He resolved to turn the fear that had seized his country into decisive action. He convened a midnight war council with Kabur and the 2 intelligence officers who had risked everything to uncover the Israeli network. "We can't trust anyone outside this room," Traoré began, his voice low but resolute. "Not the police, not the regular military, not even my own advisors. If we move now, with absolute precision." The plan that emerged was bold and dangerous: simultaneous raids on every known Israeli operational site across Burkina Faso, coordinated to the second. No leaks, no hesitations. If they hesitated, the entire mission and possibly their lives would be lost. The first strike was set for 3:47 a.m. Traoré himself would lead the assault on the largest compound, a nondescript telecommunications company, just outside the capital. "If I'm not there, they'll sense something's off," he reasoned. "I have to see it myself. I have to know." His team moved under cover of darkness, armed not just with weapons, but with an unshakable determination that the future of their nation, and perhaps the continent, hung in the balance. The compound, surrounded by high walls and patrolled by what appeared to be ordinary employees, concealed an astonishing secret. Behind the bland facade, they found a fully operational Mossad station, complete with surveillance technology, years ahead of anything locally available, weapons for targeted assassinations, and vaults filled with thousands of meticulously documented files. The most damning discovery, Project New Canaan, evidence that the surveillance network extended not just through Burkina Faso, but into a dozen African nations. One file, fresh and marked urgent, detailed plans for Traoré's own assassination, disguised as a tragic helicopter malfunction, scheduled for the following month. As each site fell, Traoré received updates over a secure line. His hands shook, but his resolve never wavered. The magnitude of what they'd uncovered was staggering. "This is no longer just about us," he told his team as dawn broke over Ouagadougou. "The world needs to see what's been done here." He ordered every scrap of evidence catalogued, every agent detained, every piece of technology preserved for public display. But the hardest part was still ahead. Traoré knew exposing the truth would invite global backlash, put a target on his own back, and potentially plunge Burkina Faso into deeper crisis. He also knew he had no choice. For years the world had seen Africa as a chessboard, its leaders as pawns. He was about to flip the board, and as the sun rose on the day of the exposé, he prepared to confront not just Israel, but the world itself. The moment of reckoning had come. The world woke up to chaos. Within hours of the raids, Traoré stood before an array of international cameras, the press corps buzzing with rumors and confusion. Behind him, tables groaned under the weight of captured Israeli surveillance equipment, encrypted computers, files stamped with foreign intelligence seals, an undeniable mountain of proof. As the cameras rolled, Traoré held up a file in one hand and spoke with a voice that trembled only with righteous fury. "Today we expose state terrorism, conducted by Israel, against African sovereignty." He read aloud intercepted communications, original Hebrew text, translated for the world to see, detailing espionage, economic theft, and assassination plot. He unveiled satellite images of Israeli listening posts, audio clips of Mossad agents embedded within his own government, and chilling testimony from captured operatives. While Israel claims to fight terrorism, he declared, "These documents prove they have conducted systematic terrorism against African nations who dared support Palestinian rights." The media exploded. For days, Traoré's name trended across the globe. International news outlets scrambled to verify the details, while governments from Paris to Washington issued cautious statements. Israel's official denials sounded increasingly hollow against the relentless, televised display of hard evidence. And just as the world began to process the scale of the scandal, similar exposés erupted from Mali, Niger, and Chad, each with their own cache of intercepted messages and seized equipment. The realization set in: Burkina Faso wasn't alone. An entire continent had been under shadow surveillance. The fallout was instant and seismic. 12 African nations, moved by Traoré's courage and the avalanche of evidence, expelled Israeli intelligence personnel within weeks. The African Union convened an emergency session, passing its most forceful resolution in decades. Their condemnation was unequivocal: no more foreign assassinations, no more secret networks, no more meddling in the affairs of sovereign African nations. For the first time in a generation, Africa spoke with one voice, not as fractured states, but as a continent united by shared outrage and hope. But the transformation wasn't just political, it was deeply personal too. Across Burkina Faso and beyond, ordinary people took to the streets. They marched not just in anger, but in pride. In Ouagadougou, citizens waved their national flag and chanted Traoré's name, while in Bamako, Niamey, and N'Djamena, people shared his story on phones and radios, in schools and marketplaces. For once, Africa's narrative wasn't being written by outsiders, but by its own heroes. Yet even as the continent awakened, Traoré knew the backlash was far from over. There were assassination attempts, threats, and the constant shadow of retaliation. The president's security was tightened, his inner circle shrunk to a handful of those he could trust. But the price of silence had always been higher. Traoré had chosen to pay the price of truth instead. And as Africa rallied around his example, it was clear that something irreversible had begun. A new era, where foreign terror was met by African courage, and the world would never look at the continent the same way again. History often celebrates its heroes long after the dust has settled, but for Ibrahim Traoré, the cost of courage was immediate and relentless. In the weeks and months that followed the exposé, the presidential residence became a fortress. Security teams swept every room daily, searching for bugs and hidden cameras. Traoré's world narrowed to the few people he could trust, a tiny circle made even smaller by the memory of betrayal. Night after night, as he gazed out over the darkened city of Ouagadougou, a single question haunted him: was true sovereignty even possible? In a world so riddled with foreign hands and hidden agendas, the threats were not empty. 3 assassination attempts targeted Traoré in quick succession, one a car bomb, another a sniper's bullet, and the last, most chilling of all, an attempt to poison his food. Each time, his survival felt more like a warning than a victory, a reminder that even the bravest leaders can bleed. Colonel Ouedraogo, once his most trusted security advisor and now exposed as a traitor, was found dead in his cell before he could testify. Officially, it was ruled a suicide. In truth, Traoré knew it was an execution, a final act to silence a dangerous witness and close the chapter on a painful betrayal. The political consequences were equally severe. International aid packages were frozen, diplomatic envoys recalled, and Burkina Faso found itself isolated from former partners. Yet Traoré refused to bow. Instead, he doubled down on his message of unity and independence, urging his people to seize this moment of adversity as proof that their struggle was righteous. Across Africa, leaders who once hesitated now stood shoulder to shoulder with him, emboldened by his defiance. But the price cut deepest on a personal level. Traoré's family lived under constant guard, and his children, once free to play in the gardens of the palace, now saw only glimpses of the outside world from behind armored glass. Friends fell away, some out of fear, others because trust was simply too difficult to reclaim. In his loneliest moments, Traoré wondered whether he had truly won, or if victory in this new world meant learning to live with permanent suspicion. And yet, even as these doubts pressed in, the seeds of hope grew stronger. 1 year after the dramatic exposure, Traoré stood once more before the world, flags of 12 African nations fluttering behind him. His voice, steady and unbroken, echoed through the halls. They warned us, the price of independence would be too high, but the price of remaining silent, of letting others steal our destiny, was higher still. The applause that followed was more than celebration. It was the roar of a continent awakening to its own power. Traoré knew the journey was not over, but as the thunder of support rolled out into the streets and across Africa, he felt the burden of leadership lighten, just for a moment. In that moment he understood, the price of courage is steep, but the reward, a free and united Africa, was worth every sacrifice. Alone in his dimly lit office, Ibrahim Traoré pressed his trembling hands to his face. The roar of the crowd outside reduced to a distant hum. For all his strength, for all the public resolve, it was in this private darkness that the real battle raged. Memories of laughter with friends who were now gone, the warmth of his family, overshadowed by armored glass, and the relentless weight of decisions that could mean life or death. Doubt clawed at his mind. Had he done enough? Could he have trusted differently? Did courage always come at the price of isolation? Yet, as dawn crept through the curtains, Traoré lifted his head. In his heart he found a quiet, unbreakable conviction. He had chosen the harder path, not for himself, but for the future of millions. In that solitude, a new kind of strength was born, the strength to keep going. If this story moved you, if you believe in the right of nations to determine their own destiny, don't let this message stop here. Share this video so the world can hear what happened when one African leader stood against the machinery of global power. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think true independence is possible in our world? What would you have done in Traoré's place? Subscribe now for more untold stories of African courage, leadership, and resilience, narratives too often buried beneath headlines written by others. Hit the notification bell so you never miss the next episode. Your voice matters. Every like,
comment, and share sends a signal that the world is ready for new heroes and new perspectives. As the screen fades, remember Traoré's words. They warned us the price of independence would be too high, but the price of silence, of letting others steal our destiny, is higher still. The future belongs to those who stand up, speak out, and never let fear decide the fate of their people. Thank you for watching, and together, let's awaken more stories that can change the world.